Hi friends, it's video time again. I know, right? 2 weeks in a row, the slump is officially over. So this video, I'm not really sure what this video is, to be honest. I read this book in December. I had wanted to read it for a while. It had been on my TBR. I read it in December. I planned the video in early January. It's now February. I wasn't really sure if I was going to make it or not, but we're here. So it might be just a little bit kind of rambling, but I read Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor, and it just made me think about a bunch of stuff that I think is maybe quite interesting or just quite important that we talk about when it comes to not just fantasy but books in general. So that is where this video comes from. Hopefully you get something out of it and it's not just me rambling to camera for no reason, but hey, we'll find out, won't we? So there will be spoilers in this video. I do want to talk about specifics, and so if you haven't read it and you don't want anything spoiled, I don't recommend you watch this video. But if you have read it, or if you just don't care about spoilers, then let's get going. So this book is about some pretty uncomfortable topics. It was inspired by an article that Nnedi Okorafor read about weaponized rape in the Sudan, where people were essentially using it as a form of ethnic cleansing. And that's where she got the idea for this book. So the main character, Onye Sonwu, she is the product of rape. Her mother is raped by an enemy general. She then wanders into the desert hoping to die, but instead she gives birth to Onye, who is just the embodiment of not just female rage, but the rage of the oppressed. She's incredibly angry. Now, because Onye's mother and father are different races and the book deals with the racial oppression of one group by another, she is physically marked as mixed race, and in this world, mixed race means the product of rape. So she is Iwu, she is known as a product of violence, and people believe that Iwu children will, because they are the products of violence, they will become violent themselves. So she is shunned, she's the constant outsider, but as she grows older and she reaches puberty, she realises that she has these powers and she starts to come into her own as a sorceress and learning how to use juju, and then realising the role that she has to play in righting this genocidal conflict that is happening between the two races. So when it comes to books, there's different ways to assess how good a book is. I always like to think of there being a scale between what you might call entertainment on one end and art, with like heavy air quotes on the other end, because what is art? Art is what people say it is. But on the one end, you've got books that are primarily for entertainment. They're very plot driven. They're not incredibly challenging, again with air quotes, but the idea is not to make people think necessarily, it's to entertain them. On the other hand, you've got books that are more about the themes and ideas that are being discussed. They're maybe there to play with the form of the novel, or they want to challenge their readers to think about certain things, or in the case of James Joyce, they just want to be incredibly difficult and keep literary scholars guessing for generations about what they actually meant. Now, in my opinion, the best books are the ones that can do a measure of both. They make you want to keep turning the pages to find out what happens. The plot is engaging, but they also are weaving in bigger ideas, bigger themes, and making you think about things. What I've found for me is that the further a book is towards the purely entertainment end, the less value that I find in it. Of course, there are some exceptions. This is not a strict rule. However, also the further it is towards the ideas end, the less I maybe enjoy reading the book specifically, and the more I enjoy reading around the book. So this was like maybe a lot of books that I read for my degree, was that reading the book itself was maybe a bit difficult, but once you started to go and read around the book about arguments that people had made about it and the scholarly literature, then that was actually a lot more interesting once you kind of understood the book a bit more. Of course, that raises questions about who gets to define the meaning of a book and so on and so forth, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this video. This book, I have to say, I found it a bit of a slog to read. I did not tear through it. I really found that it didn't catch me, it didn't hold me, and I finished it more for a sense of completion rather than out of any sort of enjoyment. That sounds a bit harsh. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it at all. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that I found it quite difficult to read. It wasn't oh, I can't wait to pick this book up and find out what happens. So for me, it's definitely towards the ideas end of the scale. I think that's obvious for anyone reading it, but it did make me question, why was it a slog for me? Why didn't I like this book? I think that's a good question for anyone to ask for any book that they read, not just, oh, well, I didn't like it, well, why didn't you like it? Or if you did like it, why did you like it? However, I think for someone like myself, as a white Western woman with a fair level of privilege, that it's important when reading BIPOC authors, authors of colour, to question, why didn't I enjoy this? Because there can be other factors that play into me not enjoying a book from a different cultural setting. As much as I talk about being bored of white Western fantasy and wanting something different, I think I underestimate how much I rely on the comfort of known structures and mythologies and just the comfort of the familiar in the books that I read. For example, this book was a recommendation from this Guardian article that I've talked about a few times that I'm kind of slowly reading my way through, which was the top fantasy novels of the 21st century, and all of them had a bit of a twist on them. They were by authors of colour, BIPOC authors. They involved settings or themes or mythologies that were non-Western. And the first two series that I picked up from there were N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy and Aliette de Bodard's Dominion of the Fallen series. Now, I enjoyed N.K. Jemisin's trilogy more than Aliette de Bodard's. I've still to read the third one in that trilogy. However, when I compare them, so N.K. Jemisin's was set in a secondary world, and Aliette de Bodard's was set in a version of our world. It's set in a kind of alternate Paris that's been ravaged by a magical war. So one of them is set in a Western European setting and brings in elements of Eastern mythology, but is still quite close to the kind of fantasy that I'm used to. And then N.K. Jemisin's is set in a secondary world. A secondary world makes everyone a stranger. Everyone reading it has to have it explained to them. So this is one of the reasons why in fantasy, or traditional fantasy, the main character would be a farm boy who lived in this isolated village, because they sort of take the place of the reader. They have to learn everything about the world, and through them the reader learns everything about the world. One of the hard things in fantasy when it's a secondary world is to explain that world to the reader without just info dumping on them. You have to disguise those info dumps in different ways and spread them out and make them interesting. But it's mostly a level playing field. Everyone is starting in the same position that they know nothing about this world. Even though a lot of these worlds are based on Western and European mythologies, those are so widely known due to the proliferation of Western literature in translation, due to colonialism, due to all of this, that even people from other cultures have a starting point when it comes to reading Western fantasy. However, Who Fears Death is set in a kind of post-apocalyptic version of Sudan. It's a distinctly African, or I should say Nigerian/West African setting. It makes references to things that you might not be familiar with if you're not familiar with that culture, which I am to only a very limited extent. So it's a lot more estranging as a setting than even though it's set in our world, it's more estranging for me as a white reader than a secondary world is, because a secondary world has to explain itself to me, whereas authors of colour, BIPOC authors, they are not necessarily writing for a white audience, but they are often expected to explain their culture for Caucasian readers. So I don't really have an answer as to whether this played a huge role in why I didn't enjoy this book so much, but I think it's important to ask that question. I do think there are aspects of the book that I don't think are that strong from a storytelling perspective. There is a framing narrative, but I don't think it's a particularly strong frame. So the idea is that she doesn't obviously want to give away too many details about where Onyé is telling this story from in the future, because the premise is that Onyé has to fight to be recognised as a pupil by the sorcerer that becomes her master because she's a woman. And when she finally does and she goes into the wilderness, she experiences death and she realises that this is a premonition of her own death, and it's herself being stoned to death. And what we realise going on is that Onyé is telling this story from her prison cell where she is waiting to be stoned to death after the events of the book, after she's righted the wrong and rewritten the great book and saved the Okeke. But while that's understandable, I think it just left the framing setup feeling very sort of, oh yes, and I'm telling the story from the future. I just, even reading those first few pages, I just felt a little bit disorientated. And that is a feeling that I had throughout the book. And as I said, part of that could be because it's an unfamiliar cultural setting. However, there were other bits, like I was reading and 1 minute it felt like Onyé was 11 and then a couple of pages later she was 13 or something like this. And I remember going back and trying to find where it had time skipped. And I was confused by that. There was also maybe this is just my own misunderstanding, but I felt like Moita was the same age as her, but then, so I was finding it a bit strange the way they were talking about him, like with older women. I'm like, dude, he's 11. Why are you talking about him this way? And then it turned out he was 16, which is marginally better. So there were these moments that kind of just, I don't know, just made me feel a bit disorientated and kind of stumbled as I was going along with the story. I also just didn't feel very engaged with the characters. I didn't feel very connected to them. Particularly, the central relationship is Onyé and Moita, and they are like two sides of this coin. Onyé hates the Nuru, she hates her father, she hates her father's people because of the violence that they do, but she's very dogmatic about it. Whereas Moita, his parents, he's not the product of rape. His parents loved each other, and that challenges the narrative, the black and white, the binary, good and bad narrative that Onyé has in her head. And it's also commenting on real life racism. You know, the oppressed aren't completely good, the oppressors aren't completely bad. But I just didn't really care very much for the relationship. And I think because it's just not really shown, there's no real build up and growth to it. She meets Moita when she's young. 20 pages later, it's time skipped forward, and then it's just, oh, and then we realised we were in love. It's very telling instead of showing. I didn't feel the relationship. And so at the end, when Moita sacrifices himself and dies, I felt pretty much nothing about that. So I think these are, at least in my opinion, some fairly valid criticisms of the book as entertainment. I'll admit that there's the possibility of unconscious bias contributing to my not enjoying it so much. I think something else that contributed to that is that it is just difficult subject matter. She is wanting to make you think about things and present you with ugly truths. As I said, this book was inspired by an article about just weaponized rape, which is just so disgusting. And the scene at the beginning where Onyé is conceived, where her mother is raped, is very, very uncomfortable to read. It's not the worst of these scenes that I've ever read, and I don't mean worst as in a judgment on the author, I mean as in my reaction to them. However, there are just some phrases and some descriptions that are just so disgusting, but that's I mean, that's how it should be. Like, it is a disgusting, disgusting act, but it's so often used in mainstream media as a way to kind of sexually excite viewers or readers. So I look back at my annotations and I've just written vile, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark in the margins. And that's how it should be when we're reading about something that is so disgusting. We shouldn't be comfortable, we shouldn't, or worse, excited. We should be disgusted. So this isn't a criticism of the book. While it made me deeply uncomfortable to read and I did not enjoy reading it, I think that is important, that we should be deeply uncomfortable when reading that. Now, Africa is not the only continent on which rape has been weaponised. Historically, one example that springs to mind is the war in Yugoslavia in Europe in the 90s. However, this book is dealing with a lot of distinctly African issues. The Nuru and the Okeke mirror the transatlantic slave trade. So you have the Okeke living in peace in the east, and they're kind of culpable in the genocide happening in the west because they know about it, but they're quite happy to keep living in peace so long as they're not bothered. Now, they're living in the poorer desert regions. The west is a land of riches and plenty. However, in that land, the darker skinned Okeke are enslaved, and it's mirroring obviously the lighter skinned Europeans enslaving the darker skinned Africans, taking them to the west, to America. This is all justified by the Great Book, which parallels the Bible, in which it states that the Nuru enslaved the Okeke as punishment for what the Okeke have done, which mirrors how white Christians justified the enslavement of Africans using the Bible. But discrimination by lighter skinned Caucasian people against darker skinned Africans isn't the only thing that is paradigm, because there is very real discrimination between lighter and darker skinned African people. There's also issues of gender bias. A lot of African cultures are still very patriarchal, and this book takes a very feminist stance. It also deals with the issue of female circumcision, which is most often called female genital mutilation in the West, which was a term that I never really questioned actually until I read this and read up slightly on it just for a little bit more background, and saw that actually even African feminists who are against the practice don't really like the term female genital mutilation, or some of them don't like the term female genital mutilation because it casts the families of these girls that are predominantly African and Arabic as mutilators who are mutilating their children, when a lot of the time the reason that they're doing it is because they feel that their daughter will be socially shunned, culturally shunned. And that's shown in the book by Onye deciding herself to undergo the ritual when she's 11 years old because she doesn't want her mother and stepfather to be shunned any more than they already are for having her as a daughter. So she willingly undergoes it, and it's only later she realises what's been taken from her, and then has the very empowering female moment where she gets to regrow her own clitoris, which I liked that was very good. But gender is discussed a lot, and the patriarchal values of Nigerian West African culture are critiqued. It's not just a case of oppressors bad, oppressed good. Onye being a woman doesn't mean that she is free from fault. She is very understandably angry, but at the same time, that anger sometimes gets in her way. So there are a lot of really interesting themes and ideas in this book. Speculative fiction, which encompasses fantasy and science fiction, has historically not had a lot of BIPOC authors. Since the 1990s, that has increased. I think it's also interesting what Nnedi Okorafor says in her article in the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature, where she talks about how writers of colour are defined by the context that they're writing in, not by their race. For example, a Japanese author writing in Japan as part of Japanese culture isn't a writer of colour, but when you take their work and introduce it into a Western context, then that shifts. But I think I particularly compare this to the Broken Earth trilogy, because that also thematizes slavery and enslavement. It is very much responding to racism and slavery in the United States, the words for, so the term origin, and then the kind of slur, roga, and the parallel between another slur that I'm obviously not going to say, but the double G sound in the middle, it's drawing on that, it's paralleling that. However, I enjoyed that trilogy much more than I enjoyed reading this. So is it just that N.K. Jemisin gave me it in a more palatable form for my sensibilities based on my history of reading primarily white Western fantasy? Did she adhere more to the rules of storytelling, the kind that they teach you in screenwriters' manuals? Or is it that Nnedi Okorafor just had more of an intention of making readers uncomfortable? She specifically says in that same article in the Cambridge Companion, she says that she knew that that's what she was doing. She calls it Big Bang literature, where it's uncomfortable, it's challenging, it's overturning your expectations. And she says she knew that that's what was doing, and it was uncomfortable for her to write it as well. So I don't really have an answer. As I said, I don't really have an answer to any of this. I am abandoning the star ratings in my videos. I did give this a star rating on Goodreads. I'm not giving it here because I would rather just talk about what I liked and what I didn't like about a book. And what I liked about this book, I suppose, was that it faced a lot of challenging ideas and themes, and that it made me think to the point that I sat down and made this kind of rambling, unstructured, not really sure what it is video about it, because I just had these thoughts in my head that I wanted to get out. That is what's strong about this book. I think as genre fiction, as what you might understand as traditional fantasy, if that's what you're looking for, then that's not what it's going to give you. So I am glad that I read this. It did make me uncomfortable. It did make me angry at times. It was a bit of a slog to get through it, but there's a reason that I finished it, and I'm glad that I read it in the end. If you've read this book and you've got any opinions on anything that I've said, or if you'd like to share your side, your reaction, if you think I'm completely wrong and that the book was fantastic and it kept you turning the pages, I would love to hear from you. And if you'd like to stick around and support the channel, then please do subscribe. It really helps. The button's just down there, and I'll leave you two alone. So hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye!